Welcome to Health Tech Heroes, where we talk to innovators who are rewriting the DNA of healthcare. Today, we are joined by Rubina Siddiqi. Rubina is a strategic medical affairs leader with over 15 years of experience in oncology, rare diseases, and autoimmunity. She founded BioAscend Inc. and currently serves as a principal consultant, specializing in transforming US and global medical strategy, driving evidence generation, and shaping value narratives to optimize product life cycles. Previously, she held senior leadership role at Kite Pharma, where she earned the Key Contributor Award for her work on Tecartus and pipeline team, and Amgen, guiding organizations through commercialization and successful asset launches. Armed with a PhD in physiology from the University of Ottawa, Rubina is deeply passionate about ensuring that complex science translates into meaningful real-world impacts for patients and healthcare systems. Rubina, welcome to Health Tech Heroes.
Thank you, Fasad. Happy to be here.
I'm so glad you could make it, and we are recording this. Rubina, your career is deeply rooted in cellular and molecular physiology. Looking back at your early days as a cancer researcher, what was the pivotal emotional moment that made you realize that you wanted to bridge the gap between lab sciences and real-world medical strategy?
It's a great question, and I think that maybe others have a pivotal moment. In my particular case, it was more of a transition. It was more of a gentle kind of fork in the road that I ended up taking. Initially, I was a PhD candidate at the Ottawa Regional Cancer Centre, which is part of University of Ottawa in Canada. There I was doing, ovarian physiology work, mostly using molecular cellular techniques and technologies, and really enjoying my time there. It was very pure bench work. And then towards the end of it, we started transitioning into more of a translational type of query and questioning. And then I went on to do my postdoctoral fellowship at UCLA, where I worked with Dr. Judy Gasson, as well as Dr. David Chang. And what we were doing, what I was hired to do, was really look at biomarkers in ovarian cancer. And based on my knowledge of ovarian cancer, really think through what might be the genome level changes that are happening. And can we target some of those changes from a biomarker perspective? So really, this was my foray into translational science, right? Much more direct applicability of what I'm doing in the lab to immediate patient care, potentially immediate patient care. So that's kind of where it started. And then from there, I moved into the space of publications, medical writing, communication, ultimately ended up at Amgen in their MedCom SciComm department, and then moved my way and was invited actually to join with the newly forming Med Affairs group that was there. And that's where I started doing a lot more direct strategy work.
That's awesome. What a journey. And it all looks very smooth from outside, right? But I'm sure there are things that you have went through, and I've been in the lab. I've gone through the highs and lows of being in the lab as well. Just as a point, Rubina and I have met each other before in the medical affairs group. I was in the medical value and access team at that point of time. You spent over a decade at Amgen and later served as senior director at Kite Pharma, successfully launching vital oncology therapies. Rubina, what was the personal challenge did you face when transitioning from a strictly scientific role into navigating complex cross-functional global leadership?
What I noticed was that all the way along, you're learning new skills, right? All the way along, whether you're moving within science, within a small organization to a large, from academia to industry. But the big thing that I really noticed was that within industry, the matrixed environment that we have and different function groups looking at the problem that you're trying to also look at, but from their perspective. So one of the things I learned was, first of all, understanding what each of these functions do, and then understanding the perspective in which they come in, but then also learning how to communicate what you're doing so that it makes sense to them as to why you're at the table. And so always learning to communicate the so what. This is what I'm doing. Here's why I'm doing it. This is how it helps you. Kind of like those are the three buckets of how I feel it's important to communicate with each other. and really learn to work as a team where each member of the team comes from a different perspective.
And this kind of perspective and the words that you're using, that comes only from the amount of experience that you have in this field. So let me double click on this a little bit, if you don't mind. So you specifically use this word, understanding their perspective, and I strongly feel about that, and especially being in medical affairs, that understanding others' perspective is just as important as our functional perspective, being in medical affairs. Can you explain in your words, like, why you think understanding your perspective, why that came up like very early on in your role and transition?
The thing is that coming from the science side of things, you pretty quickly move into the space of being a subject matter expert where you know the data. But in order to actually influence strategy and decisions related to the asset, you have to put the data in the perspective of why that's important to the other person or persons at the table. So, for example, if you have a product, but you have concerns that patients, even though you have a fantastic product, you may have barriers to its use. For example, the payers may not be allowing its use or putting it very low on the formulary or requiring multiple edits along the way before they give their patients access to this potentially, disease modifying, life changing, whatever the adjective is here for that particular asset. So this is where you would come in as the science person, is that you would pull out that one kernel of data out of the sea of data that you have and say, well, this point is what you need to emphasize with those who are presenting barriers to use. So that's what I mean about the perspective. Like, I have to look at my data from the perspective of what the other person at the table is at to solve their problem.
So that brings me to this complex web of network that medical affairs is placed in as a strategic partner, more strategic than it used to be right now. Can you name the few major stakeholders that you're working with, and what is their perspective? What are the kind of problems they are trying to solve? I understand I'm asking you to explain the entire medical affairs right now, but just 4 or 5 examples just to emphasize the complexity of what you're dealing with.
Sure. MedAffairs sits in the middle of the clinical development team that understands the data, developed the trial, looked at the patient population in deep understanding, and really came up with the trial answers. Then you've got the commercial team that's really tasked with figuring out how to market the product and sell the product. You have the team on the regulatory side that is looking at how do we take this clinical trial and turn it into something that we can get FDA approval on or European approval on. So it's just an example of 3 different groups together. There's also, for example, the manufacturing side that's thinking about supply chain and anticipating, okay, how many patients do we expect? How much drug on hand do we have to keep? What's the run time for when this drug is produced to when it can be delivered to the patient? How long does it have a shelf life? Those aspects of it. So essentially, when you think about a product from that perspective, then you have to know the data, know what pieces of data would be imperative for the commercial team to be able to highlight or showcase that is well documented in the clinical trial so you can back it up with evidence so they can develop a marketing plan. You need to know exactly what the population is well defined so that the regulatory team can move forward with the regulatory body that they're trying to present this data to and try and get approvals. And so these are the main kind of big groups that I'm thinking through. I know that a global medical affairs teams often sit on product teams, and product teams are essentially like boards of directors for a particular asset, thinking through exactly what do you need for the asset and how we're going to make this successful. How is this going to get commercialized from a scientific idea, from a clinical trial, all the way through to being available to patients. So these are kind of a general idea of, 5 groups that I'm thinking of. There are obviously many, many more functions within a company that need to get involved. The labeling group, for example, is another one. The sales team and making sure that they're well trained so they can speak to the product once it's approved. Evidence generation side on the medical side also really important. So that's just to name a few.
It's really interesting that how complex medical affairs is, because you're literally sitting in center of you're an information node for several functions. Essentially, people are coming to you for accurate information from pretty much every department in the pharmaceutical industry. I did not realize that manufacturing also sometimes comes to the medical affairs, so that's pretty fascinating. So, and also I was on the payer side, so I know that payers also depend. Payer teams also depend a lot on medical affairs, and I also know that patient services also depend a lot on medical affairs.
Yeah.
So it's just a very complex. When we go from a scientific perspective, typically a scientist is your own person, right? So we know we do everything on our own, from doing research to publishing. Everything is like our own effort, like as an individual. When you move to the pharma, how long did it take for you to change that perspective, and what is that single mindset that you can go down to like the bottom of it and say that this is what had to change for me to be successful in a matrix environment? What is that mindset?
I think in some ways, some things have stayed the same. My being focused on the data, having the data be the driver of decisions, all of that is exactly as it would be if you were at the bench doing your own work, is that you look at the data, you interpret the data, and you think about what the next steps are. I think the bigger difference is when it comes to shifting to a more corporate culture, is that the people you're interacting with are not always data centric like you are. They are looking at their own data, which they define perhaps as sales numbers or runtime for the product. You know, they have their own data that they're working with, and your data isn't really top of mind for them, and their data isn't top of mind for you. So I think the biggest shift that happened for me was to fully appreciate how important all these other aspects are in the success of a product. And from a medical perspective, success of the product for me is really defined by, are the right people getting access to this product? And is it working for them the way we anticipated it would based on the small steps that we tested in a clinical trial? So this is where that success metric for me is not even necessarily the same success metric that someone else might be using, right? And so we could stay focused on whatever is important to ourselves and not bring everybody else along, in which case you have a lot of siloed functions coexisting, but not necessarily leveraging each other. Or we can start speaking a unified language, or a language that has elements of everyone's metrics in it, partly so we can understand each other, but partly so we can synergize what we bring to the table to have an outcome that's bigger than the additive effects of what we
Yeah.
each bring to the table. Right.
And that begs the question, like, who takes this initiative? Because for a lot of people, they are coming to you, to the medical affairs, rather than you going to them. So you become a central node. So can you explain a successful story, or can you explain an incident that you have seen where you think this was a pivotal thing that the team should have and we did not have, and you were a big part of developing or setting that up?
From a med affairs perspective, a lot of company culture dictates in some ways who goes to whom. And there are still companies out there that don't fully understand the value of what medical affairs brings. And in that case, I think it's my responsibility as med affairs representative to get a seat at the table and explain what I can bring to the team. At the same time, technically speaking, in any team, it's everyone's responsibility to communicate with each other effectively. And I think that goes, like, to speak about specifics. There was a product I was working on that had a really long manufacturing run time. And it also had a lot of interesting investigator-sponsored and
Studies.
initiated data. And as the med affairs person, I was constantly in communication along with my team. So those who helped me with the administration of that program, to see where are we in the timeline of what was predicted? Where are we in the timeline of how much product we expect to use over the next year? And do we have enough? Do we have enough to supply for our commercial patients as well as our clinical study patients. And if we don't, what's the runway look like? And a lot of times people overestimate how much time it takes, or I should say underestimate how much it takes to complete the study, overestimate how successful they will be in getting the patients they like. And so we're always, in some ways, based on the data, trying to predict. So that's one example of where that interplay is really important. There are probably numerous success stories of not having a good story, not having a good narrative, and how that ended up impacting, let's say, the core visual aid that the commercial teams used. I think that now that companies are moving more and more into a global space, they understand the need for unified language and consistency in how things are being expressed, but it wasn't always like that. And I can remember a time when it wasn't like that.
So going back, I want to touch upon two timelines here within your career arc, even your life arc. You have mentioned the genuine interest in people in guiding theme in your life. Can you share a story of specific patient outcome or trusted partnership that profoundly touched you and reminded you why this collaborative work is so essential? And also, if possible, can you go back? Like, why did you even start caring about people, right? What was that thing that made you get into biology to begin with, right? You could have been a middle school student or an elementary school student or a high school student. Then you decided, like, look here, I'm going to be in biology. I'm going to do my PhD. I'm going to do this to serve patients, which is very obvious. That's what you want to do. What was that pivotal moments, those two pivotal moments highlight?
Well, I'll answer your second question first. The pivotal moment for why I decided I wanted to go down the route of science and specifically medical science was in third year university. I had this phenomenal course that I took called human physiology. And it was one of the electives that I had to take as part of my biochemistry program that I was in. So I initially had gone to university for a biochem degree, and I ultimately ended up doing a double major. That was biochemistry and physiology as a consequence of this course. And in the course, it was a year-long course, and they brought in different professors from the human physiology department, which was part of the medical school, to talk through each of the major body function systems and what the form and function relation was, say, of the kidney, the brain, the immune system, etc. I found the course to be so fascinating because, and I think part of it was because of how it was presented. It was really like a series of guest lectures or guest professors, but that connection between how the body works, so fine-tuned to end up with the right result, and how even sometimes the smallest thing can go off. You could be having some sort of kidney function problem and end up with anemia. Why? Because that's where the growth factor is needed and produced. So something small like that, in the intricate play between all of the various anatomical features and how they work together so that you end up with this exquisitely functioning designed body. That was fascinating to me. And I kind of made my decision right there and then. I think I want to continue to study physiology, which is what I ended up moving in and adding a double major and then going ahead and doing my PhD in the space.
Thank you very much for sharing that, because almost seems like you have a tendency of putting yourself in a very complex network, where you have a lot of intricacies and you want to get there. But coming back to my original questions, like why did you even get into biology? Like what was the reason you got into going back like to high school or
interested in science more than anything else. Like I was really very good at math, but it was very much like a puzzle for me. I did it for fun. And I never fully, and this is not to knock the mathematicians out there at all, but for me personally, it was fun, but I didn't see it as absolutely essential. Now, on reflection, we know that math is very essential. Oh, you wouldn't be able to build a bridge. You wouldn't be able to fly a plane. You wouldn't be able to do any of those things. But for me, it was very hobby-like, whereas biology was like, this is what I want to dedicate my life studying. It is just very cool.
And absolutely, that also makes sense in hindsight, because we always wanted to be close to the translational science. And Max is the core of all the translation science. And that completely makes sense how this has built up. Next, for the next section, we will get into BioAscend Inc. and love to hear about your new venture and how your previous experience has been brought together to do this and be a founder and be a Chief Consultant, Principal Consultant at BioAscend. In your current role as Principal Consultant at BioAscend, you help organizations transform their medical affairs initiatives. What are the primary offerings and strategic frameworks you bring to the companies trying to optimize their product life cycles?
I appreciate the question. It gives me an opportunity to talk about why I set up BioAscend. Actually, fairly recently set it up last couple of months, and towards the second half of last year, actually. And the goals around it was really, I have a deep understanding and expertise across all facets of med affairs. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that I've had, more than 15 years of experience, first working at an agency where I really executed on tasks that were given to us by our clients, which were pharma companies. And then I moved into that client facing space. So I ended up working at Amgen and Kite, really first continuing to execute and then moving into the space of really thinking through strategy. And because I already had the expertise when it came to actually executing on projects, I could think through the strategy and exactly where and how one would execute it further down the line. So I knew what the end product needed to be. So I also could then design the strategy to ensure that we are collecting the necessary pieces needed as part of our day-to-day planning and functioning over the next couple of years, so that when we do get to the time of launch, we have the essential data pieces in order to ensure the right patient gets the right drug in the right market. There's general accessibility to the product, and really thinking through, well, what about future markets and where other patients might benefit, and how could we take the data we have and adapt it to those future markets. With BioAscend, really, we're building frameworks across all stages of commercialization. I mean, supporting a product pre-launch, meaning 12 to 24 months pre-launch. That involves really thinking through the disease state, the landscape, what's the current standard of care, what is the problem we're trying to solve with our future asset, what is not being solved that this future asset solves, whether it's something that's first in class or whether it's something that might even be third or fourth in class, but offers a better risk benefit profile. Really defining what that is. What is the problem? And how are we defining that problem? And how do we help that problem? The other part of it's around, defining the value of the asset itself. How do we talk about the asset? What are the key points that we want to bring out? Storytelling, narrative, publication planning, communication planning in general, press releases, all of those parts of it. Congress planning, who are the audiences we want to bring this data to? As we think through our strategy, it's really important to have engagement with OLs or advisors, and who are the right people for us to ask our key questions to, who can give us advice that we can then incorporate to build more strategies that are reflective of the current landscape. Because the landscape, we can get outdated pretty quickly, and it's important for us to have a set of advisors that we can go to who know the pulse of what things are and how that impacts us in that future space that we want to launch a product. I think we talked about access already a little bit, but just to touch on a super important part of any kind of medical affairs offering is to really think through what might be the barriers to its use. Do we need to design something for a particular landscape? Is there a particular standard of care that payers will want you to step through? Are there OLs that can help us understand this better? So there's that part of OL engagement planning, but also medical access planning and value materials that would need to be developed. And then there's the very big bucket. So we talked about understanding the landscape and understanding the insights that we get from various sources. There's the defining the value of the asset that comes through communication. There's the medical access part of it. And then the big chunk is really around evidence generation. There's so many different ways, depending on what stage of commercialization you're in. There's the parts around really adapting the clinical data so that your storytelling communication is there. And do we need to take the clinical data and slice the data slightly differently for different markets? So that's existing data. There's also sometimes a need to generate new data in a particular market because there might be some existing barrier to use or some existing clinical practice that makes it difficult for your new asset to fit in easily. So to help understand that better, you sometimes need to develop a new study from that perspective. Observing what current practice is, understanding who those patients are, and looking at the real world evidence as a new study becomes adopted to see who's actually receiving it. We know what the labeled population is, but are they actually getting it, or is there a subset within that group that physicians are more comfortable prescribing to? And then, of course, there's the future studies and the design around that. So all of these are aspects that I can support through BioAscend. I know that there are small companies out there that may have some needs for a fractional med affairs expert, someone that they don't want to necessarily hire full time, but would like for a defined period of time or a defined number of hours out of the week. There's also project-based work I could do for them if someone, say, doesn't have promotional review capabilities and they need a medical expert to sit on that. That's something we can definitely offer, for example, or publication planning, strategic publication planning, or developing a Congress plan. So any of these things from strategy to execution, nuts and bolts, all of it, I can help provide through BioAscend.
You did elucidate the complexity of what you're doing, and just listening to you, I understand. I've been in this field, so I understand the complexity of it, but I can truly appreciate the complexity just listening to you. And when you say each one of these, like the communication or data generation, or each one of these aspects is different for different teams. So this is not just one flat layer that, hey, data generation, it is communication, this is getting insights, this is like getting insights from like different places, this is data generation or finding gaps for 20 different teams, this is communication, and it's all different for every single team, whether you're going out to the payers or going out to the regulators or going out to the HCPs, or are you going out to the oils or the advisors or the patients. And that is just fascinating. And that brings me to the next question. So if a team does not have a proper medical affairs team or a fully functional, they're still developing a team, they get a chance to actually talk to you as being an expert. What is the first thing you will look at? And what is, if there is an actionable item that they can like take on? Say I'm a startup, I have a product and going into, say, trying to get into phase 2 or something. I'm not there yet. What is the first thing you look into their medical affairs team? What is the first advice? What is the first gap you know is there? And what is that you're looking for?
Generally, it's communication, publications, press releases. Even before they get to the strategy side of things, they may not have a lexicon defined, a narrative defined, and really developing a communication plan that involves consistent descriptions of the data so that you can weave that story from one communication event to the next, and tell the story in a consistent manner. I think in my experience from early companies where they don't have a med affairs team or even a med affairs individual, it often often come up with a way of describing their data. And the clinical development team can do a great job at this initially, right? When they're talking about their data. But as you start moving into that pre-launch phase and the peri-launch phase, you're not just talking about your data, you're also talking about how does that data fit in the landscape? How does that data fit with particular patients? So really defining these aspects. But I mean, it's not a one size fits all, right? It really does depend on the individual company. But in my experience, communication seems to be the one place that they're aware that they have a gap. But really, once you dig in a little bit deeper, you realize that that gap isn't just communication, but it might actually be communication strategy, might actually be publication strategy. So the strategy piece falls out very quickly.
You brought up this gap, and what happens if you don't address it right away?
And it can be overwhelming, right? If you're not communicating your data and appropriately presenting your data, especially for early smaller companies, that could impact funding. Smaller companies are relying on milestone. They need to have milestone achievements as they reach their goals and ensure that the investors are being kept abreast of what that money is doing. Right. And so I think that's one of the first impacts. But the second very quickly becomes very important, which is the long-term strategy. right, of your asset. Your long-term strategy really does depend on having good medical strategy all the way along and partnering that strategy with your brand strategy so that the data that you want to leverage is evident to your commercial team and then presented in a way that A is accurate, B is compliant, and C um, reaches the right audiences.
That's awesome. And if you don't do this, and again, you're setting up yourself in a way that it's not going to be very favorable as you get closer to the launch. So we need to plan ahead. From my perspective, at least, as early as possible is the best time. If
Yeah.
not, if I've already not done it, right now is the best time to engage with a proper medical affairs professional. So before we get into the next section, I would love to hear about this. What is the key to building good relationships? Because it seems like you have built a lot of good relationships with opinion leaders, with advisors, and your team just around you. So this is a lot to do with relationship. What is that key aspect that is non-negotiable when it comes down to building relationships?
I think, Fasaid, really, it's like any other relationship out there, whether it's personal or professional. It's built on trust, it's built on mutual respect, respect for each other's time, respect for what we bring to the table. And I think it's important, especially when we're talking about a really good OL engagement plan, to understand from a medical perspective why that OL is important. And often our OL engagement planning on the medical side is different from what you would see on the commercial side. And what you might rank as high on a commercial team might not be the highest factor for medical. So really understanding those differences. For us, when we're talking to thought leaders out there, we're really talking to disease experts. We want to understand what's coming in the landscape. What can we anticipate in terms of changes? What are some of the problems that still exist for our patients of choice for that particular asset? Problems are getting solved with some new innovative potentially therapeutics out there? Are there particular patient populations that are more vulnerable than others? We have a lot of questions that we want to ask. And it's really important to think through who's the right OL to be able to answer that question. Go in prepared, right? So that no one's time is getting wasted and really appreciate the information that you've got, that you receive, and then do something with it, right?
Absolutely.
Do something with it. Is it an insight that you can use to impact your strategy? And oftentimes, elves want to know what happened. They want to know. I mean, I've heard this comment where some might say that pharma company comes and talks to us, and then they go ahead and do exactly the same thing that they were doing all along. Yet you had this giant ad board, and you really didn't implement anything. And I think it's important for people to understand that decisions aren't made by one ad board or one particular interaction. Decisions are made as a sum total of what we understand and know. And I think that mutual respect goes both ways in the sense that if you need to circle back and say, hey, thanks for that info, the company has decided that this is what they're going to do with the info, or I've passed this on and this is what it means. And it was very insightful and it was very important for us and it really impacted our strategy. Or we've decided to include an inclusion criteria for our study based on what you said when I went and talked to the clinical development team. Whatever that happens to be, it's within reason. Obviously, you have to take your company's proprietary information and keep it within the, we'll call it the privacy of what you need to know within the company. But you also want to do your best to maintain relations and maintain that communication about both directions.
And that's an important part when it's really hard to build relationships. And if they feel not heard, then that might be an issue, and very, very important point. And thank you very much for sharing that. So just going into the next one, we'll just look into the future and get your advice for new entrepreneurs or new leaders who are getting into the medical affairs. So the landscape of oncology and rare diseases and autoimmune therapies is rapidly evolving with new technologies. What is your vision for the future of global medical affairs over the next 5 to 10 years? I know 5 to 10 years might be too long the way things are changing, but what do you think? How is this technology going to influence? How are things going to be different in few years ahead?
When we're talking 5 to 10 years, you're right. A lot can happen in the next 5 to 10 years, particularly since we're in a place where we're in a rapidly evolving space where tools are now available, like AI tools, for example. I think that I'd like to think that in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see an evolution of broader access to markets that up till now haven't seen innovation. So markets that have patients, but for multitude of reasons, there's a lack of data in those populations with their, genetic background, for example. There may be a lack of funding in order to generate the data in those particular markets. There might be extraordinary barriers when it comes to the regulatory landscape, which then impacts how a company might approach funding for that market, which then impacts the lack of data for that market. And so everything is codependent in some ways. And of course, return when it comes to making innovative technologies and innovative health technologies available to certain markets, the infrastructure of the new market or the emerging market itself might be important. So all of these are problems that I hope we as a biotech pharma world can work towards solving, because there are a lot of people who do not have access to some of those innovative therapeutics that certain markets have disproportionately more of and certain have disproportionately less of. So that's one of the things that I'm seeing, more energy being put into broader access. I hope that comes to fruition in the next couple of years.
Super important point. Thank you very much for bringing that up. And that kind of shows that being in medical affairs, how focused are you on getting the right patient, the right access. So I'm going to combine a couple of text questions, so I'll make it a little bit more compounded question. If you were to advise a new leader who is coming into medical affairs or an entrepreneur who is getting into medical affairs, what would be that advice? And it could be the same advice for both, or it could be two different advices. What is that non-negotiable characteristics that you need to bring to the table to be successful as a leader in medical affairs, or as an entrepreneur in a medical affairs, or being a consultant, or being a founder of a medical affairs agency?
One of the skills that is very important in medical affairs, whether you're there within a larger framework of a pharma or biotech company, or whether you're an entrepreneur that's supporting business from a more fractional perspective, I think that it's important to learn to clearly define and then explain the problem that you're solving for, and to do it in a manner where you have incorporated in that communication the so what around it. This is what this asset does, and this is why we need this, because it solves this particular problem for this set of patients. So really simplify the communication, simplify it so that it's very clear to the non-expert, the non-scientist, what it is that this does. And I'm talking about it from a perspective of someone who comes from a medical affairs, scientific affairs type of background. So that's the first thing, the communication. Always be data-centric. The data has to guide that communication. You don't develop the communication and go look for the data, but you look at the data and say, what does this tell me? I think those two things, you have to really do your job well. You have to balance when you're communicating. You don't cherry pick. You really do balance the risk and benefits. So those are like the three aspects that I would say are important to give you a respectable space as a med affairs expert.
Thank you very much for that. Really thorough. I think just starting with these three things, it'll pretty much set you up on a successful path. Of course, there are nuances, but just realizing this and prioritizing this three things will really, really help any individual. And I will take this advice to my heart as well. So as a final question, Rubina, for you, you will have 90 seconds to share anything we missed or reiterate anything that you want, that you deem very important. So you can take more than 90 seconds, of course. Essentially, the question is yours, the answer is yours, and the stage is yours.
I guess to wrap up, I would say that I'm a person motivated by scientific inquiry all the way throughout my career as, a grad student, and then as a working professional. Scientific inquiry has been extremely important for me. But I've also learned along the way the importance of balancing other aspects of life along with your career, just so that, you reflect back and have satisfaction from whatever those other balancing factors are as you define them. And I think that that's been something that as a person who was really involved and very deep into work, it was a constant reminder. Sometimes life kind of pulls you in particular directions just because of where you might be. You may be a mother to children or a daughter who's managing elderly parents, or you may have other hobbies that, take you away from work. But don't think about it as taking you away from work, rather the importance of balancing so you do a really good job and you do it in a very focused way. That's been a guiding principle for me, and that was something I just wanted to share with you.
That's awesome, and thank you very much from coming from someone who's been very successful in your endeavors, and I truly appreciate that advice.
Thank you, Fasad. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be on this podcast with you.